Welcome to your third podcast on Shakespeare. This one should help you to understand the Rape of Lucrece a little bit better, how it is structured, and some of the more frequently used devices. We've already talked about some of those devices, but now we're going to talk about how those devices rhythm the structure. So first of all, your first big word for the day is narrative sententia. Narrative sententia, and this is the plural form, those are those expressions that tell us in a didactic or teacherly way something we should or shouldn't do. So we all know that coveting is very, very bad, and those that much covet, the those generalizes and covet, and then I'm going to find out what is wrong with coveting in the second half. This is narrative sententia, and it is early in the poem, the narrative poem, which tells us that Shakespeare is thinking about this sententia as he develops the rest of the poem. You have the character who's going to be grappling with coveting, and then the character who makes his decision, and the fallout from that decision. So the narrative poem itself can be seen as an exploration of this sententia. So some of the more common devices in the poem are antithesis, juxtaposition, and repetition. So I'm going to start with antithesis. Antithesis is when you have the angel with the devil in some of the lines in Lucrece, where you have something good in the same few lines as something bad. Juxtaposition is a little less strong, so antithesis is a stronger version of juxtaposition. Repetition, however, you have two forms, meaning and position. Polyptoton, which we saw with our last lesson, antanaclasis, a big word which actually simply means pun, but Shakespeare did not use the word pun, so I want you to either use antanaclasis or quibble. Epizeuxis, which is near repetition, and anadiplosis. I will go into these in class, but I want you to be aware of these words. Polyptoton was, of course, using the same meaning in a root word with different grammatical forms. Antanaclasis would be the same word but different meanings, right, in two different places. Epizeuxis is simply close repetition, and anadiplosis is where a word at the end of a line is used at the beginning of the next line, leads to another idea, idea 2, which is repeated at the beginning of the next line. Idea 2 leads to idea 3 leads to idea 3, 4, etc. You also saw parallelism in your last podcast, and you can look up as well compare and parison to find out more about the different forms of parallelism. But this is when I am using ideas grammatically similar in order and balancing them. Amplification we've already discussed, as well as accumulation and chiasmus. The only word we need to draw back in, and this is from prior vocabulary that I'm sure you have already acquired, is oxymoron. Now that is when it's an impossible state. For example, the frozen fire. It's impossible. Here, antithesis is not impossible, nor is juxtaposition. But for the oxymoron, it is impossible. There are oxymora in the Rape of Lucrece, and I want you to be looking for them. Finally, we come to a very unfamiliar word for you, I'm sure, and that's ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is when I describe a work of art within a work of art. So the Ode on the Grecian Urn is obviously an example, and you're going to have an ekphrastic passage in the Rape of Lucrece where she describes what she calls a tapestry, but it's actually a painted cloth, and it shows the Battle of Troy. So she describes that, and by doing so, she's going to be talking about her own world, her own fears, and we'll get into that in class. So ekphrastic structure, remember you can use some of these words as an adjective as well. Oxymoronic, chiastic, and I say chiastic because I want you to think of the poem itself as a chiasmus. There is a chiastic structure. Now the chi is from Greek, it's the X, and you'll find that you have a crossing of the characters in a way that rhythms the structure. So one character, begins strong, ends weak. Another character begins weak, and ends strong. And I want you to fill in those blanks for me. All right, concerning the narrative structure of the poem, I've broken down by line how things happen and what's going on when. So you have the argument and the arrival. The argument is that very first portion of the text, and then the arrival is quite swift of Tarquin. His hesitation lasts for about 74 lines, and then he's going to move to her chamber. Here he touches her, she awakens, and there's the description. This is a rather protracted moment, expanded to create some suspense. Her pleading is over 110 lines. This is important. And then there's the rape. Notice how very short it is, almost as if Shakespeare wished to preserve some of her dignity. And then we have regret, which is quick, swift, and expected because we knew that he was going to regret his decision. And then Lucrece alone is going to be lamenting, plotting what she should do. Finally, the plot is embraced, her decision, and the ekphrastic passage follows. Collatine arrives, this is her husband. Collatine arrives with her uncle, Brutus, not to be confused with Brutus of Julius Caesar, and we'll discuss that. And then you have her oath that she demands of her husband and uncle, and her subsequent suicide. So notice where the emphasis is laid. I believe this should be a 294, sorry about that. Most of the emphasis is laid on the hesitation, the consideration of the sententia, and how Tarquin can get around it. The natural elements that try to thwart his advances to her chamber. The moment before, when there's still time to change his mind, her pleading, and finally, Lucrece alone. Look how long how much time he spends talking, letting her talk and letting her explain her humiliation. So those are some of the more frequent structural and language devices used. And we're going to continue and talk just a little bit about the prosodic features of this text and other Shakespearean texts. So the way you read, and this is called scansion, right? The way you read text depends on, in English and in German, stressed and unstressed syllables. So here's a stressed one, unstressed. Sometimes it's a little short shape above the letter, and a longer one for the stressed, but I'm just using a little minus sign here. So you have different forms of feet based on the number of syllables within the foot. This may or may not include all of a word. It could stretch between two words, so be aware of that. So disyllabic feet, of which there are 4, come in 4 different forms. You have the unstressed, stressed, which is the iamb, the stressed, unstressed, which is the trochee, pyrrhic, unstressed, unstressed, and spondy, which is 2 stressed syllables. Some trisyllabic feet are found within the lines. It isn't infrequent, but it is certainly not the norm. So you have different versions of stressed, non-stressed. I think that perhaps the most common that you would be finding in Shakespeare, because sometimes he wants to bring forward a syllable, would be the anapest or anapestic foot, short, short, long, possibly the dactyl, long, short, short. Now, all of this said, Shakespeare is trying to make these lines fit into the prescribed form of pentameter. Penta, of course, is 5, and pentameter would imply 10 syllables and 5 that are stressed. So, epenthesis. Epenthesis is when you add a letter to the middle of a word to stretch it out and create, most likely, an unstressed syllable, an extra unstressed one. Syncope. This is when you admit you pull something out. Prosthesis, additions to the beginning. You already know this in Much Ado. Apheresis, this is when you take something away from the beginning. Paragogy is the addition of a letter or syllable at the end. And apocope is omitting at the end. Syneresis, 2 syllables elided into one. This is very frequent. Synalepha is the coalescing of 2 vowels across a word boundary, ending one word and beginning the next. Right? So these ways of making ideas, words fit into a line are very frequent in Shakespeare, and not that you need to know each of these words. I don't hold you to that, but I want you to be aware that Shakespeare knew of these, and that's how he planned and shaped or molded his lines, his words, in order to fit. And it may also be one of the reasons why we have such wonderful creations of words like bemonster, an addition to the beginning. To conclude, I want you to remember that Shakespeare was very free within his constraints. We've seen freedom with his language, where he could create words such as bemonster, but also there was no formal grammar at the time for English. You didn't study English grammar in the schools, you studied Latin grammar. So he's very free with what he does grammatically. And another last thought is, when he gets into his writing mode, he's typically using iambic pentameter, but be aware that you're going to see trochees as well, slipping in, and I would say most commonly it would be trochees and then anapest as far as variations are concerned, and some pyrrhics. So as you are reading Shakespeare, why don't you go ahead and mark out the lines with unstressed, stressed, to see if you can figure out where he intended for the actor to lay stress and where he intended for him to mute certain words so that other words would come forward more strongly. Thank you, and that ends this 3rd podcast.